everyone. There's still a few people trickling into our virtual discussion space here, but we will go ahead and get started. We're here as part of the Law, Ethics, and Animals Program Speaker Series, which is presented today in collaboration with the Yale Sustainable Food Program, the Yale Environmental Law Association, and the Yale Animal Law Society. Want to give a quick hello to our friends in Toronto. I believe we have Professor Angela Fernandez and her entire animal law class joining us from University of Toronto Law School. So we're now officially a multi-school event. Today, we're so fortunate to have Aryenish Birdie with us to talk about anti-racism in animal advocacy, to talk about our organization Encompass and their new book, Antiracism and Animal Advocacy, Igniting Cultural Transformation. This is a collection of essays written by animal protection advocates themselves who are committed to explore and prioritizing racial equity as we work to create a more effective and just animal protection movement. Real quick about Aryenish, she's the founder and executive director of Encompass, which is a really exciting, relatively new nonprofit working to make the animal protection movement more racially diverse, equitable, and inclusive. Prior to her work with Encompass, she spent several years at PCRM, Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, working on promoting alternatives to animal testing. She received her degree from Hampshire College in critical social thought, race and feminist theory, and took a master's in public management from Johns Hopkins. If you haven't heard about Encompass and their work, and if you want to support what you hear today, I really encourage you to visit their website, hit the donate button to reciprocate for the time that Aryenish is generously donating to us today. The work we need to do to combat racism and animal protection won't come and shouldn't come for free. And it's really important that we fund and support this crucial work. If we just the people here today donated $5 to $10 each, we would really have a nice donation to go along with the talk that we're going to be given here and the conversation that follows. So I'm going to get out of the way and turn over the floor just real quick administratively. If you could be sure to mute yourself. There will be a Q&A after some opening comments. I will moderate that. If you want to get into the queue, drop your name into the chat. You can also drop questions into the chat as you go. But remember to hit that mute. We love seeing your dogs and your children and your significant others, but we want to keep the audio track clean. So just watch that mute button. It's really easy to get off mute by accident. So with that, I'm going to turn it over and take it away, Aryenish.
Thank you so much, John. And wow, what a wonderful little spiel for Encompass. I really appreciate that. I'm going to start sharing my screen. So can you all see my screen? Okay, great. I'm seeing some thumbs up. Wonderful. Well, I'm going to be talking today about how we can apply a racial equity framework to animal protection work, a little bit about what Encompass does and how everyone in this room can show up for this work. And I hope to leave a good amount of time for questions. So please, as I'm going, if something comes up, don't hesitate to use that chat feature. So I wasn't sure if we could do group intros. It sounds like that's not going to work. So I'm just going to share a little bit about me. As John said, I'm the founder and executive director of Encompass. I use she, her pronouns. I've been in the animal protection movement since 1997. I've worked on just about every animal issue there is out there, from puppy mills, zoos, circuses, fur farms, vivisection, and pretty much every way in which animals are experimented on. That was really my entry point to these issues. So it's a place that has a very special spot in my heart. And that's what I was working on at the Physicians Committee as a lobbyist. I would love to know at some point why you have decided to show up today. In general, if there's anything that you can share as you're writing questions in the chat, or even if you want to let me know later. I think it's really important to have a kind of an insight into what makes us show up. I think that's an entry point to how we show up for this work. There's so many places that you can be. There's so many webinars happening now. So it's always kind of special for me to hear why this one. So by way of moving on, I'm going to start by sharing a little bit about Encompass. So we believe, and I personally believe, that the animals need everyone's advocacy. I think everyone in this room probably agrees with that. If you're in this program, if you're studying this issue, you know that we need the biggest, baddest movement there can be. And at the same time, we know that racial inequity holds our movement back and stifles our impact. And I'll get more into the how and why of that in just a little bit. So today, our movement is a small fraction of what it can be, largely because we're such a homogenous group of people. And as a result, animals are suffering and perishing. And so what we're really working to do is making the farm animal protection movement more effective by fostering racial equity so that everyone can bring 100% of their brilliance to work for animals. And that's really our guiding light is, can everyone join and can everyone show up with their fullest, most authentic selves, because that's how we do the best work for animals. So we envision a movement that operates at its fullest potential because it reflects the globally diverse population, the nationally diverse population that we have here in the US, and we embrace a culture of equity. So our strategy is really rooted in three kind of equity principles. One is leadership equity. We believe that leadership teams should reflect the racial makeup of society, and that those teams should be skilled at talking about race, racism, and their effects on our work as animal advocates. And we should be able to translate that knowledge into action. We think that equitable work is just a core tenet that should live at all levels of our movement. So our programs should be culturally responsive and explicit about how factory farms harm human and non-human animals, how they disproportionately harm people of the global majority. And that's a term we use at Encompass to be a little bit more globally inclusive in scope. We know that people of color is a term that's very US centric. I will interchange those for the sake of this talk, but just to kind of put a little note that we normally use people of the global majority at Encompass. And so we know that those communities are the most important stakeholders in a way because they are the closest to the issue. And we need those voices in leadership roles. And right now that's not happening. So we want to see real accountability. We want organizations' budgets to reflect the stated values, and more organizations are stating diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, justice, liberation as core values. And we want that devotion to racial equity to live connected to accountability. So that means we have to prioritize continuous improvement and have clear and transparent accountability measures at all levels. So to back up a little bit, the US Census estimates that people of color make up more than 40% of the US population today. And in about 28 years, it's expected that we'll be 51% people of color in this country. Meanwhile, fewer than 11% of advocates at the largest US-based, the largest and most well-funded US-based animal protection organizations identify as people of color. So there's a pretty significant gap there that we have to work to rectify if we plan to have any hope of staying relevant, of being relevant, in the decades to come. And we know that without this, much of the work we do will fail to meaningfully engage communities of color. So both internally in terms of how we do work at an institutional level, but also with individuals and individual communities, on both aspects, we have to integrate racial equity into what we do and how we do it. And again, I want to just be really pointed that factory farming disproportionately harms communities of colors through food apartheid, labor exploitation, and environmental racism. And each of those could be 1-hour talks, 2-day trainings unto themselves. I'll just leave it at that for now. So racial inequity in our movement limits our people power and stunts our growth. And this is all coming from research out of some of the best academic institutions, Yale, Harvard Business Review, also companies, Twitter, Facebook, the biggest tech companies, all the Fortune 500 companies are researching these very principles. And so I've taken a lot of those learnings and applied them to the animal movement. So we know that homogeneity hinders creativity and innovation, and decreases productivity, works to support burnout, and exacerbates racism in society broadly. If we're an animal movement that proclaims to be about justice and liberation, we have to integrate those values in how we treat one another. So the bottom line is, if we fail to address racism and racial inequity in our movement, we cannot achieve our mission of building a kinder world for animals. It's really It's really that simple. And more I'm hearing people say we really should be moving past making the business case. We have to work with people who understand that this is the bottom line. So while there is a problem, while there is a deficit in our movement, and to be frank, across the entire nonprofit sector, there is, of course, an opportunity. So in the private sector, as I was mentioning, studies have found that diverse and inclusive teams bring in more revenue, they're smarter, more creative, insightful, effective. These are all hyperlinks. I can get you citations if that's helpful. They enjoy lower rates of burnout, stronger feelings of belonging and engagement, and they reflect the world that we're trying to create, which means that we can be more adaptable, resilient, and successful. So when our movement embraces racial equity, we'll see the impact of helping animals amplified, maximizing effectiveness. And a lot of us know that effective altruism has really infiltrated the animal protection movement. And while there are some problems with that approach, and that's again a separate talk, I think there is a lot of validity and understanding and trying to think through how can we maximize our dollar, how can we do the most good for the most individuals. And one of the ways that we can do that is by integrating racial equity, because it really will help us maximize our effectiveness. We'll see advocates thrive because they'll have the tools that they need to contribute at the highest level. And that's a real tenet of equity. Equity speaks to giving people the things that they need, whereas equality is giving everyone the same thing. And the same thing is often determined by those who are in positions of power. And so that's why we talk much more about equity in this work rather than mere equality. So we want our programs to reflect the world we're trying to change. Again, so we can attract the brightest, most talented advocates to our cause. That's really the only way we're gonna succeed and thrive, is if we have the very best working for animals. So pursuing racial equity is not just the right thing to do. It's not a nice to have. It's central to achieving our vision of a world where animals are treated with respect. It's a must-have. So our vision for a racially equitable world, we have kind of 9 tenets that we operate by internally at Encompass. So I'll go through them quickly. One is that philanthropy favors, supports, and encourages racial equity work that's integrated into advocacy. Leadership ranks hold a critical mass of Black, Indigenous, and people of the global majority. Staff, philanthropists, stakeholders, and leaders are skilled at talking about race, racism, and its implications. Programs are culturally responsive and explicit about race, racism, and race equity. Communities are treated as stakeholders, leaders, and assets to this work. They're not tokenized, they're not used when it's politically expedient. We are really working to build authentic and genuine relationships. Evaluation efforts incorporate the disaggregation of data. This is really important internally for teams if we want to capture and understand where we are now and the metrics for where we want to be in the future. Expenditures reflect organizational values and a commitment to race equity. Accountability parameters are clear and transparent, and community-centric approaches to global advocacy are integrated. And this is really an effort to avoid imperialism. And just a note on this, I'm seeing a lot in the animal movement, a desire to move outside of the US, especially because meat consumption is growing at astronomical rates in countries outside the United States. I also am hearing a conflation between diversity and doing international work, and those aren't always the same things. And I think we need to be able to pull those apart. So in many countries, for example, Brazil, many people who we in the US might identify as people of the global majority identify as white in their countries. And we need to be able to pull apart, how does colorism live? How are systemic white supremacy culture principles manifesting internationally? And also, are we in the US trying to simply export values that live here without understanding the sensitivity of the dynamics that are country and region specific? So all of those things have to be taken into very serious account. So what we do at Encompass, we work to empower organizations, and we're actually right now working to launch a membership program. To date, we've done a lot of direct consulting with organizations in the farm animal protection space. And we're actually working on a pivot right now to help organizations better understand the future direction of where they should go and how they can get there. So working at a bit more of a macro level, and we'll have more information coming out in about 6 weeks or so. So if you're interested, join our newsletter and you'll learn more that way. We also work to empower Black, Indigenous, and advocates of the global majority directly through our caucus. And that's a closed space specifically for these advocates, for us, where we can work to build community. And that's one of the most commonly cited gaps in the movement in general, but especially amongst advocates of the global majority, not only because we are remote and we're spread out, but because there are so few of us. That feeling of hopelessness, but also isolation is very real. And so we really work to try to build community and remind each other that we're all here and supporting one another. And through that process, we strengthen our personal resilience, build our leadership skills. Another thing that we offer is a talent database where advocates of the global majority can get connected directly to opportunities in the movement. A lot of times we see and we know that it's the animal movement and just all social movements are who you know, but that often looks like a reflection of the people who are around. And we know scientifically that people tend to be around people who look like them. So how do we penetrate this? We're trying to create ways to foster better connections. So in our talent database, we're connecting people to speaking positions at conferences, board positions so they can take leadership roles, volunteer roles if they're interested in offering a skill, and absolutely most importantly, staff positions. So if you're interested, again, check out that link. And once a year, we have an executive development cohort for people who are more advanced in their careers, who are either in senior leadership roles or are looking to be entrepreneurial and start their own company or their own organization. It's a 3-month program where we focus each session on a specific challenge like fundraising, ABCs of nonprofit management, et cetera. We go into depth looking at the specific challenges that people in the cohort face, and then we culminate it with a pitch day where we can connect funders directly with advocates. So it's a really great program, and again, we usually do it in the spring. We're also doing research. So we're actually in the middle of doing a research project with a consulting partner right now. We hope to have it published in December or January of this year. And what we're looking at right now is where the movement thrives and where extra attention is needed. We're looking at racial equity metrics currently to benchmark for future success. The goal is to be able to create a reproducible report that we can reevaluate in 3 to 5 years over the course of time to see how we're progressing. We're also looking to understand challenges and dynamics organizations face as it relates to racial equity and how the animal movement compares to other social justice movements. And just a note to say that this was modeled loosely off of the Green 2.0 reports. If you don't know about them, I would check out Green 2.0 or Diverse Green. They have kind of 2 names. And they have some really amazing research out there that looks at racial equity in the environmental sector, which in my mind is really a sister movement. So we're trying to learn again from others who have done this work. We also offer a training. We'll be having our 4th training in just a couple weeks, and everyone here is invited. The URL is right here. In our 2-day trainings, we explore the ways racism operates in our society and the animal movement, how fostering racial equity in organization leads to increased innovation, collaboration, and stronger impact, and why opting out leads to underperformance, and concrete strategies and methods for organizations to operationalize these practices. And so out of this training actually is where our book came. So in our inaugural training last March, we were talking, it's a very dynamic and interactive session. We were talking about how white folks can show up for this work, how they are showing up for this work. And a participant said, I really want to write a personal blog about this. I feel like I work through concepts by writing. And then someone else echoed that. And this idea came out, what if we had an essay collection that was our personal kind of vulnerable stories, where we are in our journeys, how we've come to get where we are. And there was enough enthusiasm for it that we had it turn into an essay collection, which lives on the Sentient Media website. And the day it launched, a publisher actually approached us and asked us to turn it into a book. And so that's the book that we have here today. It launched almost exactly 1 month ago, September 15th. And it's been an absolute pleasure and joy. We actually sold out in the first 2 weeks, which was amazing. So we're already doing a second print, and I'm just really, really honored to be a part of this with these amazing authors. So in the book, you'll see 8 BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color authors and 8 white authors. And we're very clear to not showcase these voices as necessarily experts in racism or anti-racism, but really just people who are like anyone else on their journey. We broke the collection up into 4 core themes that often mimic what everyone's journey is to coming to animal advocacy or to anti-racism, starting with an awakening, going into introspection, looking at what accountability looks like, and then how we can lead. And so each section has about 4 essays, and they're again, just really powerful and beautiful. And we took great care to showcase how white people grapple with their internalized white supremacy, how they're shifting towards anti-racism actions, and how this is playing out in their workplaces. And we've gotten several comments, actually notably from people of color, saying, why did you have so many white people write this? You know, this is not what I expected out of a book like this. And so I want to highlight this quote from Sonia Renee Taylor, who's an amazing Black woman, humanitarian, advocate, speaker. And when I read this quote a few years ago, it really shifted my mind and how I wanted Encompass to work and how I wanted to engage white people in particular. And I'll read it. She says, I don't want an ally because an ally means you came here to help me. How are you helping me solve a problem you caused? Why aren't I helping you solve the problem you caused? Why am I not the ally and you the actor? Why is Blackness the responsibility holder and whiteness gets to be the helper? And I think when we talk about allyship, it often means supportive. It means us taking a step back. And in some cases, that is the right thing to do, to take a step back and listen. But it also means that in order to be an accomplice, to be a co-conspirator, to be someone who's actively anti-racist, we need white people to really stand up and acknowledge that this problem has been caused by whites and that the responsibility holder really is on that demographic. And so I'm sure there'll be some questions for that in the Q&A. I'm happy to get into that, but I just think this quote is really powerful and speaks to the role of white folks and how we engage them. So in that process, we wanted to really showcase the vulnerability, the hesitation, the confusion, embarrassment, denial that comes out of engaging with this work, especially as white liberal people who often have our identities wrapped up in being good people, as people who are fighting for some of the most vulnerable creatures who live on our planet. There's a lot of identity work that needs to happen, and we wanted to showcase that. And in that process, we wanted to showcase the curiosity, determination, conviction, and leadership that white folks have and how they stepped up in writing these essays. BIPGM wrote about how being in this movement impacts us and our ability to fight for animals, and really underscores that effectiveness point that I was making earlier. And so with all of that, I do have some reflection questions for you. This is largely just rhetorical and for you to kind of sit on right now. What are ways, or what is one way that racism is operating right now in your academic circles or in the legal circles? And what kinds of power do you have to create an equitable movement? No matter where you sit, no matter how many marginalized identities one has, we do have some power, and being able to identify that is really important. So when we do our trainings, we often look at who and what the agents of change are. And I'm not gonna go through all of these right now, but these are just some agents of change. And you'll notice at the top, academics and highly skilled experts. And everyone in this room, I would say, is at least both of those, if nothing else. And so I want to really underscore the power that you have in whatever positionality you have. Just by virtue of being in this room, I know you have a significant amount of power. And so sitting on that and resting on that and understanding what that means, how you want to exert that, and how you want to be change agents is really important. And so coupled with that is understanding the necessary investments for this work. And so again, I'm not going to go through this list. Money, capital, mental energy, strategic planning, all of these things are necessary for making an investment. And at times you may focus on one over another, but I think it's important to be able to understand that all of these things are necessary at some point or another in your journey towards anti-racism. So some next steps for you is to identify why doing racial equity work is important and to be able to articulate it authentically, genuinely, from your positionality, not simply by rote, not simply by copying the Black Lives Matter statement of a company that you've seen or posting a black square on social media. This should be something that comes out of critical thinking and introspection and difficulty and fear and vulnerability. And being able to articulate that is the first step and a very important step. It's not one that should be just glossed over. And then identify how you can make racial equity come to life in your sphere of influence. And even if that sphere of influence is your 3 friends or your family, how can you have these conversations? How can you make this work come to life? Because that really is what those of us on the receiving end need. So we also always say that it is important to not wait for consensus, especially if you're working in a team. We are working for those who are the most marginalized, those who need change the most, who are most desperate for change. We're not looking at the greatest number of people. Of course, we know in the country and in the world, we are the greatest number, but that's not what we're looking at. We're looking at who needs this change most desperately. And so noticing that pace. Are you pacing for privilege? Are you pacing for those who are most marginalized? We know that if we were waiting for consensus, women wouldn't have the right to vote. Queer folks wouldn't be able to get married, more examples that we all know about. So just to note that consensus is not the goal here. So even after we decide to pursue racial diversity and equity, we might be afraid of conflict. And fear is the number one thing I hear from white folks in their early stages of engaging with this work. There's actually research that shows conflict is much less severe than anticipated, especially in diverse teams. So working to move through that fear is really important. And in Encompass, we use a framework called the comfort zones and panic zones. You may have heard of it, where it says basically as you start working on something, your panic zone is very big and your comfort zone is small. But as you get more comfortable, your panic zone shrinks and your comfort zone expands. And the goal is to get to a point where you feel more comfortable with the fear, with the making mistakes, with all of that, that you can have the conversations more easily. It's also important to remember that when things get difficult, it's really easy to throw racial equity out. And this is why we don't focus on all marginalized issues simultaneously. This was something a lot of people, especially funders, when we were first launching, asked us to do, to talk about gender equity, to talk about sexuality issues. And of course, those are really important to me. And I have found that when we talk about multiple issues simultaneously, the race issue is the first to go because it's the most difficult, it's the most intractable, it's the one that has the most consternation. And we want to be able to say we're carving out space to specifically talk about this because it's the most difficult, because we haven't for so long. And again, just a point to say, don't let fear hold you back. You have to anticipate it. It's going to come up. You're going to make mistakes. Keep moving forward. And I just added this little bullet right before. It's really important to remember that the fear whites experience is much less pronounced than the racism we experience. And so if that fear comes up, I think it's important to remember the perspective of the global majority. So we have to actively develop our cultural competence. No one is culturally competent in every area. Again, it's really important to remember that. I am still working on this. I'm absolutely not perfect, even though I'm in the front of the room a lot of the times. I am still a person with a good amount of light skin privilege. I have made mistakes. And so I am trying to remember that the goals are to strive for continuous improvement, to expand my comfort in doing this work, and that integration is key, that we're not working to have a separate project that's DEI or racial equity. We need to integrate it in everything we do. We need to think through, if we're making SMART goals, strategic, time-bound, measurable, we need to make them SMART-T goals, which includes inclusion and equity, where we're thinking through every project, every paper, every endeavor through a lens of how is this going to foster greater inclusion and equity. So making this work come to life is really important. Never stop doing your own personal work. Continue to research and learn. That can look like a lot of different things. A good first place to start is understanding racial justice concepts. And why this work leads to effective organizations. If you're still finding that you need to better understand this, that's a really good place to start because there's a lot of research out there. Encompass has created a resource guide for white folks, which includes a lot of different kinds of media toolkits, podcasts, movies, articles, videos. We have a lot of different tools on that hopefully will speak to your learning style as a way to get started. It's important to develop a shared racial equity literacy and vocabulary within your organization. A lot of times people don't know if they ask me, should I say Black or African American? And there's not consensus about how we have that conversation. I don't know what white supremacy culture means. I thought white supremacy was just the KKK. Understanding what these terms mean is really important for us to get on the same page so that we can address the problem in a more holistic, honest way. And so here's a starting point, and I'm happy to share these links again, that can be helpful. As leaders, and I think everyone in this room really is a leader, it's really important to name racial equity as a strategic imperative in your work. Again, using your own voice with your leadership teams, boards, if you're on the board of an organization, show up. That's really important. If you're in a position to solicit the support of a racial equity consulting partner, get a proposal. If you're at an organization, submit it to foundations and funders. I'm hearing from more and more funders that are saying, we want this from organizations. Open Philanthropy Project, one of the largest funders in the movement, is saying, we want all our grantees to work with consulting partners, and we will give them funding to do this work. So it's really important to not let finances hold one back. And if you need to fundraise for this work because it's not in your budget, do that and then keep it in your budget indefinitely. Of course, hire people of global majority for leadership roles and other skilled positions rather than just intern roles, entry-level roles, or roles where we're doing outreach to our own communities. That's really important to making sure that we have strategy direction from diverse voices. And if you're a white person, it is really important to name racism when you see it, to name the goals of anti-racism, and to use your relational power. As a person of the global majority, it can mean sometimes death to name racism. It can mean significant harm. It can mean losing our jobs. It can mean a lot of very scary things. And as a white person, just through virtue of being white, that harm is not as pronounced or as significant. And so it's really important to, at the very least, speak truth to power if you're in a position to do so. So my final slide here, if you're interested in supporting our work, please consider buying a copy of our book. You can do so at our link here. You can listen to an audiobook. Again, we're trying to reach people in all the different styles of learning and listening that they can. So we have an audiobook on ourhenhouse.org. Follow us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. That's our handle, Encompass MVMT. Share our work with your colleague and friends. If you're of the global majority, please consider joining our caucus. We'd love to have you. It's an amazing group of people. And please consider, as John said, becoming a monthly donor or one-time donor. It really helps us do this work. And that's about it. Thank you so much. I look forward to your questions.